What it do, anime crew? Amen. Listen, today I just finished one of the toughest watches that I've had in a long time, but also one of the best movies I've seen in a long time. It is Love and Pop from, I believe, 1998, a live-action movie directed by Hideaki Anno, which is centered around the concept of subsidized dating in Japan, which is basically just a practice where young, like high school age girls go on dates with middle-aged men for money. It's just like a different form of prostitution, essentially. And it's like a really, really interesting. I hate to say Ava-esque because it's kind of like vague and doesn't really get down to it, but hopefully I'll be able to get more into what I mean by that as this video goes on. But it's like a weird coming of age story about growing up and all of the horrible things that may entail, and how being traumatized and taught to value certain things about yourself can change the type of person that you end up becoming as an adult. But it's, for one thing, I have to get out of the way, it's shot extremely quirkily. Like, every single shot, Anna was just thinking, where's the weirdest place I can shoot this from? And a lot of times it has like a lot of meaning, and there's like a great deal of variety to it. He's always trying to do something new with each shot. Sometimes it is just kind of like flowery, like for the sake of itself, a little bit quirky, or maybe I just don't get it. The one example of that, which I actually ended up disliking the most, was when on two occasions he just filmed a conversation with the camera spinning around the two characters, and it made me want to throw up from dizziness. But other than that, it is exceptionally well and exceptionally uniquely and thoughtfully shot, and that's something that I really appreciate. That's something I have to get out of the way. Also, there are like weird dream sequences with trains. There's a bunch of like intricate like layered symbolism, especially in those dream sequences, that I won't be able to totally get into here because I would need like a pen and paper to write out and really nail down all of my thoughts and understanding of what they even represent. But it's Hideaki Anno. There's a lot of Anno-isms. There's a great emphasis directorial on the main girl's hands, which is specifically relevant to her character, but also just a motif throughout several of Anno's works. infamously in Evangelion, the last episode, end of Evangelion, Shinji looks at his hand and there's, stuff on his hand. And in the first episode, he looks at his hand and there's blood on his hand. And this is sort of a very similar symbolism here, because especially in Ava, there was an emphasis on hands as like the visual representation of like how we interact with each other. Looking at your own hands is like one of the most common and accessible ways to like literally like look at yourself or look at your own body. You can just put it right in front of your eyes without having to even move your head. And so there's a sort of introspective element to the symbolism in that sense, but also they are what we reach out and touch, reach out and potentially like hurt, steal from, embrace, like all these things, everything we do to interact with others, Anno likes to represent through hands. And this main character is somebody who is like, clearly still developing into herself, like as a person. She mentions that she has like profound emotional experiences that she feels like should be changing her life. But then, she just kind of gets overwhelmed in her brain and she ends up falling asleep. And then the next day, it's like nothing happened. She kind of goes back to just being comfortable, normal high school girl who's trying not to think about the future too hard. She talks about how her relationship with her friends has lasted so long, not because they have a tight-knit bond from being so open with each other, but rather because they never breached that sort of unspoken layer of comfortability that comes from like asking the tough questions and prying and trying to get to the bottom of these emotional disturbances that plague them all. It's just sort of something that isn't as developed as it should be, and she feels it slipping away from her. She feels the pain of growing up, as we all do. She is walking down the train tracks, which are a very common symbol for youth and, youthful naivety and like ignorance and fun-loving nature, playfulness, like all that stuff. That which her dad still possesses and, is a very important thing used in the imagery, especially when juxtaposed later in the film. Scenes of videos taken from when she was a child playing, as well as her friends playing, playgrounds, the train set, all of these like more childish motifs and images that are contrasted with the audio of all the guys talking about the stuff that they are willing to pay to do with her, what they want to do with her and how much they're willing to pay. And it's sort of this like gross reframing of what she sees herself as, and just like where her life has taken her. It's very interesting because she gets into this for the sake of getting a ring on her hand, which she thinks will bring her some sort of value. She is not somebody who has a tremendous amount of value in herself. She clearly craves human connection, as she explains when talking about her own personal sex drive earlier in the movie. She's like, yeah, I just kind of want to be held by somebody and feel their warmth. That's sort of what the desire sprouts from for me. I'm not as much as, just a freaking horny monster or whatever, like a lot of these old businessmen are. But she clearly has a desire to connect and have a sense of belonging with somebody, which is something that everybody wants. Like, these guys that are always like commissioning all these young girls for like sex and stuff, obviously it is like elite sleazeball activity, and this movie never loses sight of that, but at the same time humanizes them for their reasons. Sometimes, like, even diegetically, the main girl overly sympathetic to the cause of that guy who just wants them to like spit on grapes and then give it to him. She's like, it feels wrong. It feels a little bit distasteful to do all this. And part of that sprouts from her being overly empathetic to his circumstance when he's clearly not respecting her as much as he should. But another part of that sprouts from her just sort of being insecure and uneasy about the idea of this being her value now, and sort of growing into this person who needs to do this kind of stuff to get money. But yeah, it humanizes these guys, not in the sense that it paints them out to be like good or even at times redeemable people, but in the sense that it gets to the root of why they so like viciously seek this stuff out. And it is more of a sense of disconnectedness, loneliness in adulthood, a desire for companionship, a desire for the social validation that companionship brings to prove somebody wrong. And then oftentimes, the wires end up getting crossed, and things are embellished by their actual like carnal sexual desires, perverted tendencies, all that kind of stuff. But it's like clearly emphasized that like most of the adult figures besides her family, which I'll get into in a little while, in this girl's life, like all the people that she interacts with who are adults are just like ravenous horn dogs who are extremely lonely and hate their jobs and hate their lives, and have no friends. Basically, she meets a guy who's literally just talks to a doll, and that's like his only friend. And there's actually a really good scene when she meets him. They have like this kind of cool moment where he's like, "Oh wait, you do sign, you know sign language," when they're like trying to meet each other from across the bridge. She's like, "Yeah, my mom actually does it. She like volunteers to like help kids or whatever." And they're like, "Oh wow, what are the odds? There's chances. This is such a cool environment." And then they meet up face to face. He's like, "All right, let's get a hotel and have sex." And it's just like, man, like what could have been a totally normal functional connection is like totally reframed. It's like, no, this guy is, he is here strictly for, basically sex, like all the others. And it's this really sad, it's sort of an exploration of the perceived, I don't know, I'm American, like fetishization of purity that happens across almost all modern cultures that I know of, but stereotypically, especially Japan, where people see it as like something that ought not to be defiled, but at the same time these guys are all trying to defile it. There's one like incredibly hypocritical and difficult to watch moment later on in the film. It's sort of, so halfway through, this is what I'll say before getting into like the psychology of all the characters. This girl does all these things with her friends, and she really doesn't want them to leave because they're all developing into people with full-fledged personalities and self-worth and places to go in life, and she feels that she's sort of getting left behind and just spinning her wheels, and she's not developing as a person. And she doesn't really feel that she has any reason for this. She has, of course, a very supportive family at home, which after the traumatic events which transpire towards the latter half of this movie, she comes home to, and they're just like, "Hey, how was everything?" And she can't really like tell them, and they're all just being so functional that it's like a, suffocating to her, and she's like, I can't blame them for being good-natured and happy, but at the same time there is a sort of subconscious or very much conscious resentment there because of all of the stuff that she has just went through and all of the dysfunctionality she has essentially just been burdened with. It's very dark ending. I don't think it's a very happy or hopeful ending, but the movie is disturbing, but ultimately has a lot more instances of the girls sort of like having fun, I guess. Like, it's always very thoroughly underpinned by the bizarre, gross nature of like what they're engaging in. But toward the beginning, it's like this whole movie shot quirkily. There's like this weird classical soundtrack, and the girls are genuinely having fun. They're talking. The main girl's introducing her friends and hyping them up because she likes them so much. She doesn't want them to leave. But essentially, after the first half of the movie, they all go their separate ways for the day, and she's alone for the rest of it. And the tone changes subtly but dramatically at the same time, in my opinion, because it's like she was uncertain and insecure and surrounded by horrible things in the first half of the movie, but she was like, not overly bothered by it, and she was doing okay. And then by the second half of the movie, she's just all on her own, and it's extremely lonely, and the only people she has to interact with are these guys who basically see her only value as what she can provide for them sexually, which is something that she's uniquely susceptible to because she's still growing up. She's still developing her own sense of self-worth. She still really wants to get that ring and make herself look beautiful and come into, what she sees as her own personality and fashion sense and how she wants to present herself and, all this stuff. And she's basically getting the signal from all these guys like, hey, this is where I derive my value from. Like, this is what I bring to the table. They bring money. I bring this, which is obviously an incredibly harmful thing to internalize about yourself if you don't want to be taken advantage of like a million times in the future. And it's a really bad thing that happens to a lot of people who are sexualized at a very young age. Which ostensibly is a huge problem, especially in Japan, if this practice is or was actually even somewhat socially accepted. I assume the context of the movie with the guy being like, yeah, I'm writing a story about it or whatever, is definitely implies, and I'm sure this isn't just like normal commonplace. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm under no delusion that's like, oh, thank you, Japan. This is just like their version of fucking going out and bowling with your friends. Like, no, I know this is not a normal thing. But I wonder to the degree of which it is sort of chastised, like to the degree which it is like looked down upon. I hope it would be immensely, but I don't actually know the exact numbers on that. Not that there would be numbers, but it's the story of this girl wanting not to be alone because she doesn't want to be alone. She seeks out, this validation, and she learns that the way that she can seek it out is basically through her body. But at the same time, she's repeatedly told that she shouldn't give it up to anyone, and she's like disgusting, and she has to like keep it safe because she could be making some guy out there who really cares about her feel horrible because she's naked in front of another guy, and it's like absolutely just mind-boggling, backwards logic, of course. But all right, I'm getting off on way too much of a tangent. It all leads back to this primary character arc of Hiromi. She doesn't want to be alone. She has trouble developing her sense of self. She seems to seek out comfort and admires potentially maladaptive traits in her friends of, like, for example, not being able to say no is something she mentions admiring. And it's like, I believe she is, I could be wrong about this, but she's very insecure about being overly drawn to comfort, about feeling too quick to move on, too quick to accept the way things are, and that because of the fact that she doesn't proactively seek out change in her life, it is passing her by, and she's growing up before her own eyes, losing the value that she once inherently saw in herself as a child, and sort of having that replaced with, this newfound sexual value, if you could call it that, when it's simultaneously being criticized and looked down upon, and people are trying to use it. One guy tries to use it to make her feel disgusting, basically. highlights this desire within her for companionship, this desire to have connections, to have all these things, but her insecurity about not being worthy of them, or like not feeling like she should just be able to get them in any way that's not transactional, I would say. Like, she's trying to develop that in herself and develop a sense of pride, but she's like doesn't really have the words for it. She doesn't seem to like totally understand it yet, and it's really, 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 really difficult to watch as she sort of stumbles her way through it and loses the desire to really seek out anything, because she has such a connection to the idea of like comfort, of like wanting things to stay the way they are, wanting to stay attached to her youth, because don't we all? But then at the same time, when she comes out of her shell and exposes herself to the world and is vulnerable, she gets like horribly traumatized for it. And it sort of teaches her to keep going the way things are. It's not healthy for very obvious reasons. I don't know. This rank kind of sucked. I thought I was going to have more to say, but I feel like I have so much to say that I'm losing track, and then I'm like gaining back a new train of thought, and then it's just blah, blah, blah. The point is, this is shot very interestingly. It's extremely introspective. The psychology of the characters and how they develop is super interesting. There are various different journeys of coming to terms with maturing and sort of going into this world where companionship is much more transactional, and they're learning what parts of themselves are valued by other people and how they personally can attract that companionship and all that stuff. It's very, very interesting. I recommend you guys watch it and form your opinions for yourselves. It is an extremely uncomfortable watch. Trigger warning for everything, pretty much. But very, very interesting and very, very poignant. So yeah, that's about all I have to say about that one. Eek, that sucked. Sorry, Otakun.